Hi, and welcome to the Chapter 7 podcast. This is Paul Anderson, and today I have a special guest with me. Today our special guest is the bamboo plant. Bamboo plant won't say much during the podcast, but he's really, really important. Bamboo plant and plants in general are really cool because they can do one big thing, and that is make food. So this chapter is about photosynthesis, and we just covered respiration in chapter 6. And photosynthesis kind of sits right on the heels of that, and it's a nice transition into that. The picture I have right here is some wheat, and I wanted to show you that because but plants are really important to us. They provide food, and they also provide oxygen. A lot of the oxygen actually comes out of algae that live in the oceans, but we require oxygen, and plants are able to give that to us. And so a good way to think about animals is that we are parasites on plants. We do respiration, so we break down food, glucose, like that would be found in wheat. We break that down to get energy out of it, ATP, so we can do things. But plants aren't making food for us. In other words, plants are making food for themselves, because a misconception people have is that plants do photosynthesis and animals do respiration. Remember, that's totally not true. Plants are making food, and they're making that food for themselves so they can eat it. So if you've paid attention in the last chapter, it's going to come in handy as we go through photosynthesis. If you look at this equation up at the top, it looks really familiar, and that's because it's the same equation as for respiration. It's just that glucose is on this side, oxygen is on this side, and then carbon dioxide and water are actually what go in. And so again, the products of cellular respiration are going to be the reactants of photosynthesis. Now, is it the same process? No way. Photosynthesis doesn't resemble respiration in any way, except that the reactants equal the products and the products equal the reactants. And so this is this looks like Elodea, which is an algae that grows underwater. These little bubbles that are coming out of it are going to be bubbles of oxygen. And so in photosynthesis, oxygen is actually given off. Now, photosynthesis only has 2 stages in it. And it's easy to remember those 2 stages if you just remember the word photosynthesis. Photosynthesis has 2 parts. It's got the photo part, and then it's got the synthesis part. Photo is, an easy way to remember that is the light-dependent reactions. Light-dependent reactions are actually going to occur in this structure right here and on something called the thylakoid membrane. So light's going to come in, water's going to come in, and we're going to give off waste product of oxygen right away. Now, the 2 things that are made, because oxygen is not important here, it'll come in later, but the 2 things that we make are going to be ATP and then NADPH. A good way to think about what NAD is, remember that's very similar to NAD and FAD that we had in cellular respiration. That P now stands for, let's just say it stands for photosynthesis. It's an easy way to remember it. What's it carrying, though? It's carrying those high energy electrons to the Calvin cycle. Now we can see that some of that is actually recycled back, and so we're going to add ADP and phosphates. They're going to come back and we'll recycle those just like that ionized NAD. What comes into Calvin cycle is going to have carbon dioxide come in, and then the function of that carbon dioxide is actually to make glucose. A few things of the chloroplasts. So chloroplasts are going to be similar in structure to the mitochondria. They're going to be inside these cells in the leaf, and in some leaf cells there will be dozens and dozens of chloroplasts that are sitting inside of that. They look kind of like a solar panel, and they work the same way. So here's that thylakoid membrane, and then there's this liquid portion around the outside called the stroma, and they're lined up almost like solar collectors. So as light comes in, they were able to absorb a lot of that visible light. Now, why are plants green? They're green because they're reflecting that light and then they're transmitting that light. A good question might be, why aren't they black? In other words, if they were black, they could absorb all that light. And the probably good reason for that is that chlorophyll is green, but it's made that way so we don't get too hot. Chlorophyll itself is kind of cool. And so if you take chlorophyll, and we'll do this in class, and you actually suspend it, it will look like this color. And when you hit it with light, it will fluoresce. So when you hit it with especially ultraviolet rays, photons will hit chlorophyll. It'll get those electrons really, really excited. What does that mean? They move out to a higher energy level, and then they have to go somewhere. And so as they fall back, they give off energy, and so they give that energy in the form of a photon. Now, what's neat about photosynthesis is we're actually tapping that energy. And so here's an analogy. And so hopefully you know what an analogy is. It's just a model that explains explains how the light-dependent reactions work. Light-dependent reaction is kind of the stumbling block for photosynthesis. It's something that kids get confused with. First of all, there are two photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Why does photosystem 2 come first and photosystem 1 come second? It's just because it was discovered after photosystem 1. What happens? The energy actually comes from a photon. It's going to get those electrons excited, and the electrons are going to move out to a higher energy level. As they fall back down, we're going to have an electron transport chain where we actually make ATP. This is identical, at least the movement of electrons is identical to the way we do it in respiration. In fact, the ATP synthase is going to show up again. Now, those electrons already have a little higher level. They're going to get hit by another photon in photosystem 1. Those electrons even get bumped up to a higher level, and then we're able to store those electrons in NADF. Okay, let's see where that actually plays out. So here we are in the thylakoid membrane. Inside the thylakoid membrane, we're on this membrane right here. And so here's photosystem 2 again. Thinking to our analogy, that's where that first photon comes in. It hits these pigments, and the electrons are transferred from 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 until it eventually hits the one in that center of the photosystem. We call that the reaction center. Those electrons are going to get excited, and they're going to transfer that electron to a carrier molecule. Now, once we've moved those electrons to a higher level, there's a spot at the bottom. In other words, there's a place here where we have to fill it with another electron, and that's the role of water. Water is going to actually transfer its electron into the fill that spot. As it does that, it splits water into oxygen and hydrogen protons. And so those hydrogen protons will come in handy in just a second, but that oxygen is now a waste product. It's going to leave. Now what do we have? Electrons moving through an electron transport chain. As it does that, we pump some protons to the inside of the thylakoid membrane. It gets whacked by another photon. That's going to move those electrons to an even higher level so we can make a little bit of NADPH. This NADPH and then this ATP are going to move to the Calvin cycle. Now, how did we make the ATP? Look here, it's the same exact way we did in respiration, except everything is reversed. And so ATP synthase is there again. These protons that came from the water are going to flow through that, and they're going to generate ATP. Identical to the way we did it in respiration, just backwards. Now, what happens next was actually, it took a while to figure this out, and this is Melvin Calvin. He got a Nobel Prize for this, and what he's doing is he's stopping the cycle at different levels, and then he's using some chromatography to figure out all these intermediates. What do you need to know as far as the Calvin cycle? Well, it's similar to the Krebs cycle, except instead of giving off energy, it's actually using that energy. And so what comes into the Calvin cycle is carbon dioxide. We use the power of ATP and NADPH to actually convert that into a high energy molecule called G3P. Now, G3P is going to be used to make glucose and other compounds. Eventually, it's going to make like a bamboo plant. All of the energy to make that and spin that carbon dioxide into something real comes from NADPH, ATP, and then ATP again will recycle this into RUBP, and there's an enzyme called Rubisco that'll actually attach that onto a carbon dioxide. And so it's really similar to respiration. In review, light-dependent reaction, function of that, take in light, split water to oxygen, make ATP and NADPH. Function of the Calvin cycle, take in carbon and eventually make sugar. Now, just like when we were doing respiration and we talked about fermentation and problems that come from that, there is a problem in photosynthesis, and that is something called photorespiration. Photorespiration occurs when a plant is living in a hot environment. And if you live in a hot environment, your stomata, in other words, the thing that allows carbon dioxide in, you have to close it. And the reason you have to close it is because we want to minimize water loss. The problem with that is that we're not taking in new carbon dioxide, and so a weird process occurs where oxygen is actually taken in. It creates carbon dioxide eventually, but we get no energy from that. That's the name photorespiration. That sucks for a plant because you're taking in oxygen into the cycle and you're getting nothing for it. And so there's two ways that they've gotten around that. First way is using what's called a carbon a C4 plant, and what they do is they take in the carbon dioxide, they make a 4-carbon compound instead of a 3-carbon compound and store that down in the mesophyll so they can have the Calvin cycle occur down there where there isn't as much oxygen. Or in CAM plants, they'll actually take that in at night, they'll store it as a 4-carbon compound, and then during the day they can actually run the Calvin cycle, and they don't have to worry about that photorespiration. And so that's photosynthesis.